They fired me for consulting, then paid me triple to fix what I built. I never thought I'd share this, mostly because it still feels unreal even now, like something that happened to another version of me who made slightly worse choices and trusted people a little too much. But every time I open my email and see the subject line that started it all, my chest tightens in the same familiar way. Quick sync, HR plus leadership, sent at 8:07 a.m. on a Tuesday, the kind of meeting that pretends to be routine while quietly rearranging your entire life. I remember sitting at my kitchen counter that morning, coffee going cold, Slack already buzzing with messages I didn't have the energy to answer, telling myself it was probably nothing, just another compliance update or reorg rumor, because that's what you do when you've learned to survive corporate anxiety by minimizing everything. By the time I logged on, my calendar had been wiped clean for the day, except for that one meeting, 30 minutes blocked off like a surgical incision, and I felt the first real flicker of dread. I'd given this company 6 years, climbed from analyst to team lead, absorbed 2 layoffs worth of extra work without complaint, answered messages on PTO, skipped funerals and birthdays, and one entire vacation that never got rescheduled, all because I believed the lie that loyalty eventually circles back and rewards you. When the call started, I saw the familiar faces pop in one by one, my director smiling too hard, an HR rep I'd never met, and someone from legal who kept their camera off, which should have been my cue to brace myself. I listened as they thanked me for my contributions and dedication before explaining there were concerns about my external engagements, a phrase so vague it almost felt polite. And as they spoke, I realized with a strange clarity that this wasn't a conversation, it was a conclusion they'd reached without me. I didn't interrupt, didn't defend myself, just stared at my own reflection in the corner of the screen and wondered how I'd gone from indispensable to disposable without noticing the exact moment it happened. The part that still makes my jaw clench is how calmly they explained it, like they were walking me through a benefits enrollment screen instead of dismantling my career in real time, because apparently someone had flagged that I was engaged in secondary employment without disclosure, which violated policy, full stop, end of story. I remember asking what secondary employment they were referring to, already knowing but needing to hear them say it out loud, and my director cleared his throat and said the words freelance consulting like it was an accusation instead of the thing that had kept my savings from evaporating during the last round of frozen raises. I explained again that it was nights and weekends, that it wasn't a competitor, that it had been cleared verbally 2 years earlier when my workload doubled and my pay didn't. But the HR rep smiled with practiced sympathy and told me verbal approvals weren't documented approvals. That was when it hit me that this wasn't about policy at all. It was about optics, about someone higher up realizing how thinly staffed we were and deciding the easiest solution was to cut the person who made it obvious. They asked for confirmation that I'd accessed outside systems on company hardware, and I said no because I hadn't, because I was careful, because I'd learned the hard way that women who do extra work are only praised until someone needs a scapegoat. Legal finally spoke, voice flat, explaining that effective immediately my access would be revoked and my role terminated, severance contingent on signing an agreement I hadn't even seen yet, and I felt this strange dissociation wash over me, like watching myself nod along from across the room. I thought about the late nights spent untangling other people's messes, the time I trained my own manager on tools I'd built, the performance reviews that called me a cornerstone, and how none of that mattered now because a line in a handbook mattered more. When the meeting ended, my Slack logged me out before I could even type goodbye, and I sat there in my quiet apartment staring at my laptop, realizing I'd just been erased from a place that had consumed most of my adult life, not with a bang, but with a polite calendar invite and a smile. The first hour after being fired felt unreal in the quietest way, like the world had muted itself while I sat on my couch, refreshing my email even though I knew nothing else was coming. No follow-up, no clarification, no apology for how abruptly they'd ended things. HR sent the separation packet about 20 minutes later, a PDF full of cheerful headings and legal language that managed to sound both friendly and threatening at the same time. And I remember laughing out loud when I saw the section titled Next Steps, because the next steps apparently involved me disappearing quietly and not talking to anyone about what had happened. I skimmed the severance details, doing the math in my head, realizing how carefully calculated it was to give me just enough to keep me from panicking, but not enough to make me comfortable pushing back. That was when my phone buzzed with a text from my coworker Jenna asking why my Slack was deactivated, and I froze, suddenly unsure of what I was allowed to say, unsure if honesty would cost me money I couldn't afford to lose. I typed and deleted 3 different responses before settling on something vague about a policy issue, hating myself a little for protecting a company that hadn't protected me at all. As the day dragged on, adrenaline gave way to exhaustion, And I started replaying the last year in my head, spotting all the warning signs I'd ignored because I was too busy being grateful to question them. The sudden insistence on documenting every hour, the offhand comments about commitment, the way leadership praised my output while quietly redistributing credit upward. I realized my consulting work hadn't been a betrayal. It had been survival, a way to reclaim some control in a system that kept demanding more while offering less. That night, lying in bed staring at the ceiling, I felt the grief finally land. Not just for the job, but for the version of myself who believed hard work alone could protect her. And as much as it hurt, there was also a flicker of something else beneath it all. A sense that maybe, just maybe, being forced out of a place that never fully valued me wasn't the ending they thought it was. By Thursday, the rumor machine had already done what it always does, which is take a human being's life and turn it into a cautionary tale with missing context and extra drama. And I knew that because Jenna finally called me instead of texting, whispering like we were plotting something criminal. She told me my director had told the team I chose to pursue other opportunities and that leadership wished me well, which was such a polished lie, I almost admired the efficiency. Then she said the part that made my stomach drop. They were framing it like I'd been moonlighting for a competitor, like I'd been stealing time or data, and apparently someone in finance had joked that we caught her before she could do damage. I felt heat rise up my neck, not because I wanted their approval anymore, but because I hated how easily they could rewrite me into a villain when I'd spent years being the dependable one, the fixer, the person who stayed late so other people could go home. Jenna sounded torn between loyalty and fear, and when she asked what really happened, I told her the truth in a flat voice, and there was this long silence where I could practically hear her recalculating what she thought she knew about our workplace. Then she dropped the detail that changed everything. Right before my termination meeting, leadership had circulated an internal business continuity plan for my department, and the plan was basically a single page of bullet points that boiled down to redistribute responsibilities across existing staff. No backfill, no contractor, no transition period, just a vague promise that my work would be absorbed, like it was liquid you could pour into whatever container was nearby. I hung up and sat there staring at my wall, realizing they weren't just firing me, they were erasing the fact that my role had been holding up an entire set of processes that no one else understood end to end. And the messed up thing is, I'd warned them about that for months in careful emails and polite meetings, saying we needed redundancy, we needed documentation time, we needed cross-training, and every time I was told to be strategic and focus on priorities. My priorities had been keeping the place afloat. Their priority had been making sure nobody noticed how close we always were to sinking. The following week felt like watching a slow-motion accident you couldn't stop because you were no longer in the vehicle, just standing on the sidewalk with a clear view of the impact. Jenna kept me updated in cautious fragments, texts sent late at night or during bathroom breaks, telling me how my workload had been split across 3 people who were already overwhelmed, how meetings kept getting rescheduled because no one could answer basic questions I used to handle without thinking. Apparently, my director kept insisting everything was under control, even as deadlines slipped and clients started asking why response times had doubled, and hearing that stirred a complicated mix of vindication and guilt I wasn't prepared for. I didn't want the company to fail, not really, because real people worked there, people I cared about, but I also couldn't ignore the bitter satisfaction of being proven right after months of being dismissed as overly cautious or dramatic. Meanwhile, I was dealing with the practical fallout of unemployment, updating my resume, canceling subscriptions, calculating how long my severance would realistically last if nothing else came through, all while pretending to friends and family that I was enjoying an unexpected break. The consulting work I'd been doing on the side suddenly became my main focus, and the irony wasn't lost on me that the thing they fired me for was now the thing keeping me afloat. One afternoon, while I was on a call with a client who actually listened when I spoke, my phone buzzed with a number I recognized instantly, my former director's, and my stomach dropped even though I let it go to voicemail. He didn't leave a message, but the call itself felt like a crack in the wall they'd built, and I knew, deep down, that it wouldn't be the last. For the first time since that HR meeting, I felt a shift in the balance of power, subtle but real, and it scared me a little how much I wanted to see what would happen next. It took exactly 9 days for the first crack to turn into a full fracture, and I know that because the voicemail finally came on a Friday afternoon when I was folding laundry and trying unsuccessfully to feel normal again. My former director's voice was tight, rehearsed, asking if I had a moment to clarify some documentation questions, which was corporate code for we're in trouble, but we don't want to admit it. I didn't call back right away, partly out of spite, and partly because I needed to remind myself that I didn't owe them anything anymore. not explanations, not free labor, not emotional cushioning for their bad decisions. When I did return the call hours later, I kept my tone neutral, professional, the way women are taught to sound even when we're standing on the edge of something that feels like justice. He launched into questions about process flows I'd built, automations that no one could seem to locate, decisions I'd made years ago that were now suddenly very relevant, and with each question, I could hear the panic creeping closer to the surface. I answered carefully, truthfully, but without filling in gaps they should have thought to document when I was still on payroll, and when he finally asked if I'd be willing to come in for a short-term consulting arrangement to help stabilize things, I almost laughed. Almost. Instead, I told him I'd consider it and asked him to send details in writing, watching the power dynamic flip in real time as he agreed far too quickly. After we hung up, I sat there staring at my phone, heart pounding, realizing that the same company that had fired me for consulting was now about to ask me to consult for them. And for the first time since this all started, I didn't feel small or disposable. I felt steady, grounded in the knowledge that my value hadn't disappeared when they cut off my access. It had just been inconvenient for them to acknowledge until they had no other choice. The email came 10 minutes later. Subject line, urgent support request. Like urgency was supposed to make me forget the way they'd walked me out with a scripted smile. And inside was a neat little proposal that tried to sound generous while still treating me like a resource they could spin up and down on demand. They wanted a 2-week contract. Limited scope, remote if possible, hourly rate left conveniently blank like they expected me to fill it in with something modest out of lingering guilt, and the best part was the closing line. We appreciate your willingness to help the team during this transition. Transition. Like I gently stepped aside, like they hadn't accused me of betrayal and cut my access mid-sentence. I read it twice, then a third time, and I felt something settle in my chest. Not anger exactly, but clarity. Because if they needed me badly enough to come back, then I had more leverage than I'd ever had while employed. I called Jenna first, not to gossip, but to confirm what I suspected, and she didn't even pretend anymore, just exhaled into the phone and said, "It's chaos. They can't close out month-end, client escalations are stacking, and your director keeps acting like you left a messy desk instead of an entire system in your head." I opened my laptop and pulled up my consulting rate sheet, the one I'd always been afraid to show anyone because women are trained to apologize for asking to be paid, and I adjusted the numbers upward until my stomach flipped. Then I added terms. Minimum hours, upfront retainer, clear deliverables, no on-call, and a clause stating any requests outside scope would be billed at a higher emergency rate. I kept it clean and professional, but every word felt like reclaiming a piece of myself they'd tried to shrink. When I hit send, my hands were steady, and the moment after, the silence felt loud, like the pause before thunder. 5 minutes later, my phone rang again, same number, and when I answered, my former director didn't bother with small talk this time. "That rate is higher than we expected," he said, voice strained, and I let the quiet stretch just long enough to make him feel it. "It's the rate," I replied, "for someone you deemed valuable enough to fire." He tried to negotiate the way men like him always do, as if my number was a starting point and not a boundary, asking if I could meet them halfway because budgets were tight and leadership would have questions, and I almost told him I remembered exactly how tight budgets suddenly became every time I asked for a raise, but somehow weren't tight when they hired a new VP with a signing bonus the size of my yearly salary. Instead, I kept my voice calm and said, "If budgets are tight, then you should prioritize the work you need done most." And he went quiet, because he knew they didn't have a prioritized list. They had a pile of fires and a team running around with buckets full of holes. He asked what I meant by retainer, like he'd never heard the concept, and I explained politely that I don't start emergency work without a deposit, especially not for a company that had proven it could cut me off without warning. He sighed, a long exhale that was supposed to make me feel unreasonable, then asked if we could hop on a call with HR and finance to align, and I agreed, because I wanted it in front of witnesses. The call happened an hour later. 3 faces on screen, including the HR rep who'd smiled at me during my termination, and it was almost funny how different her expression was now, all warmth and careful respect, like I was a valued partner instead of a policy violation. Finance asked for justification for the rate, and I gave it without flinching, listing the systems I'd built, the hours I'd carried, the risk exposure they were currently facing, and I watched their eyes shift from skeptical to calculating as they realized replacing me wasn't a matter of hiring someone else. It was a matter of rebuilding institutional knowledge I provided at this price. There was a pause, and then my former director said, almost defeated, "We'll approve it." And I felt something inside me unclench. They emailed the contract within the hour, and when I saw the line item labeled Emergency Stabilization Retainer, I smiled for the first time in weeks, not because I was happy to help them, but because they finally had to pay for what they'd taken for granted. I started Monday the way you start any job you're technically not an employee of anymore, with a cup of coffee, a fresh notebook, and the kind of emotional distance you have to build like armor. They'd shipped me a temporary VPN token overnight, which felt both hilarious and insulting. Because 2 weeks earlier, they'd treated me like I was smuggling secrets out of my purse, and now they were begging me to reconnect. My contract said remote support, but within 30 minutes of logging in, I had 3 separate pings from people who'd never spoken to me directly before, all with the same frantic tone. Do you have a minute? And quick question, and can you jump on a call? Like my time was suddenly elastic. I didn't jump on anything. I created a queue, sent one message that said I'd be working requests in order of criticality, and waited for the inevitable pushback. It came from my director, of course, asking if I could be a bit more flexible given the urgency, and I told him I was flexible the same way a surgeon is flexible. I can't save you faster by skipping steps. The first actual issue I tackled was the month-end reporting pipeline, the one everyone assumed ran on magic because it always just worked, until I wasn't there to babysit it. I opened the logs and immediately saw what had happened. They'd tried to reroute a dependency to a shared folder someone didn't have permissions for, and the whole workflow had been failing silently for days, while leadership kept promising the client everything was fine. I fixed it in under an hour, documented the change, and sent a short summary to finance, and their reply was basically a digital gasp of relief. Then I moved to the next fire, and the next, each one revealing the same pattern. People had been touching systems they didn't understand, overriding safeguards they'd never bothered to learn, and then acting shocked when the consequences arrived. By lunchtime, I had a running list of breaks caused by improvisation, and it was long enough to make me queasy. The weirdest part was how everyone talked to me now, like I was a specialist they needed to impress, like my opinions mattered, like I hadn't sat in those same meetings as an employee and been told to be strategic and not overcomplicate things. At 2:13 p.m., my director asked if I could provide a simple overview of the architecture for leadership, and I stared at the word simple until I wanted to throw my laptop out the window because nothing about what I built was simple. It was just invisible when it functioned. I agreed anyway, scheduled a briefing for the next morning, and as I typed the invite, I realized something that made my skin prickle. This wasn't just a rescue job, it was a stage, and they were about to try to rewrite the story with me in it. The briefing invite hit everyone's calendars like a flare, and by the time I joined the call the next morning, there were more faces than I'd ever seen in a quick overview meeting, including 2 executives who couldn't have picked me out of a lineup when I worked there, but now smiled at me like we were old friends. My director opened with a chirpy recap about temporary support and knowledge transfer, framing my return like a collaborative handoff instead of an emergency salvage operation they'd created by firing the only person who could keep the lights on. I let him talk, watched the little boxes flicker as people nodded along. And when he finally handed it to me, I shared my screen and started with the simplest truth I could manage. The system wasn't a single pipeline, it was a chain, and chains break at the weakest link, which is always the piece no one thinks about until it snaps. I walked them through dependencies, the hidden automation jobs that run at 2 a.m., the vendor quirks, the permission structure, the fail-safes I'd built after painful lessons, and I kept my tone neutral even as I saw a few eyebrows lift in alarm. Halfway through, an executive interrupted me to ask, "So if you document this fully, we won't need ongoing external support, right?" And there it was. The real motive slid into the conversation like a knife wrapped in a compliment. I smiled softly and said, "Documentation helps people understand what exists. It doesn't create experience overnight, and it doesn't replace decision-making context." And I watched the room go slightly still as they realized I wasn't going to hand them a cheat code to replicate 6 years of work in 2 weeks. Another leader asked why the system had so many custom elements, and I explained that half of it was custom because leadership had demanded speed while denying resources. So I built scaffolding that let us move fast without collapsing. And the other half was custom because their standard tools had failed under real-world load. My director jumped in to soften it, saying we'd evolved quickly, but I didn't let him rewrite it as organic growth when it had been chronic understaffing and me refusing to let things break. When the meeting ended, a VP messaged me privately saying, "Appreciate your transparency," which in corporate language meant, "We had no idea what you were doing, and that's terrifying." 10 minutes later, my director called me directly, voice low, asking if I could tone down the risk language in future updates because it was spooking leadership. And I felt that familiar old anger flare, the same impulse to protect them from consequences, to make the truth palatable. I took a breath and said, "I'm not here to make people comfortable. I'm here to stabilize what's failing." And for a moment, he didn't have a response. By the second week, the tone had shifted from panic to control, which is always the most dangerous phase because it convinces people the crisis is over when it's really just paused. My inbox filled with polite check-ins from leadership asking how things were trending. And I answered with facts, not reassurance, listing what was stabilized and what was still fragile, because I'd learned the hard way that soothing executives only delays the next failure. Meanwhile, the team was burning out fast, and Jenna told me in a hushed voice that 2 people had cried in the bathroom that week alone, overwhelmed by the realization that my job hadn't been 1 job, it had been 4, compressed into 1 title and 1 salary. One afternoon, my director asked if I'd consider extending the contract just a bit to finish documentation, and I felt that familiar tug of obligation, the instinct to help, to make it easier for everyone else, even at my own expense. I asked what would happen after, who would own the system, how they planned to support it long term, and he gave me a non-answer about realignment and future hiring discussions, which told me nothing had actually changed except their immediate discomfort. That night, I sat at my kitchen table reviewing the contract, realizing how close I was to repeating the same pattern in a different wrapper, giving more than I should because it felt responsible. The next morning, I told him I'd finish what we'd agreed to, but I wouldn't extend without a clear plan and a different rate, one that reflected not just my time, but the cost of continued risk without structural change. He sounded surprised, then irritated, then resigned and said he'd take it back to leadership, which I'd come to recognize as code for hoping I'd cave. Instead of waiting, I scheduled my own call with finance and laid out the numbers, showing them what downtime would cost, what attrition was already costing, what replacing me piecemeal would actually look like over a year. I didn't threaten. I didn't posture. I just told the truth plainly. And when the call ended, there was a long silence before the finance lead said, "I don't think we understood the scope of what you were covering." And for once, it didn't feel like too little, too late. It felt like leverage settling into place. The approval came faster than I expected, which told me everything I needed to know about how deep the damage actually was, because companies don't move quickly unless the alternative scares them more. Finance emailed confirming the revised rate and an extension window contingent on leadership alignment, and my director followed up with a carefully worded message thanking me for my partnership, like we were equals who'd chosen this together instead of people standing on opposite sides of a decision they regretted. I agreed to the extension with conditions spelled out so clearly there was no room for interpretation, and the moment it was signed, I stopped answering after-hours messages, stopped cushioning my updates, stopped pretending urgency on their part constituted obligation on mine. Something unexpected happened in that space I created, though. Something quieter than revenge and louder than closure, which was that I started sleeping through the night again. I stopped waking up with phantom Slack pings in my head, stopped replaying conversations, stopped bracing for emergencies that weren't mine anymore. Work stayed work. My consulting clients respected my boundaries because I enforced them from day one, and the contrast made me realize how warped my old normal had been. At the company, leadership finally approved a headcount request they denied 3 times when I was an employee. And Jenna told me the team announcement landed with a mix of relief and resentment because it was hard not to notice that change only happened once I was gone. One afternoon, as I was wrapping up documentation, my director asked if I'd consider coming back full-time, floated casually like it was a compliment instead of a reversal, and I felt a surprising calm when I said no. Not a dramatic no, not a bitter one, just a steady refusal rooted in the knowledge that I'd already seen how easily they could turn appreciation into expendability. He sounded genuinely confused, asked what it would take, and I told him the truth, that it wasn't about title or pay anymore. It was about trust, and that trust doesn't regenerate just because systems are stable again. When we hung up, I stared at my reflection in the dark screen and barely recognized the woman looking back. Not because she'd hardened, but because she'd finally stopped negotiating her worth in rooms that only listened when the consequences got expensive. The real turning point didn't come from anything dramatic or explosive, no slammed doors or viral emails, but from a quiet realization that settled in during a Tuesday afternoon when I finished my final deliverable and closed my work laptop without that old reflexive urge to check one more thing. I sent the wrap-up summary to leadership, concise and factual, outlining what was stabilized, what still required ongoing ownership, and what risks remained if they continued to treat people like interchangeable parts instead of institutional memory. My director replied with a thumbs-up emoji, which would have infuriated me months earlier, but now just felt oddly small, like watching someone try to end a novel with a sticky note. That same day, one of my consulting clients offered to extend my contract for 6 months at a rate that made my old salary look embarrassing. And when I said yes, it wasn't out of desperation, it was choice, a word that still felt unfamiliar in this context. Jenna called me later, voice low and careful, to tell me leadership had quietly stopped using my name in meetings, referring instead to process improvements and lessons learned, as if removing the human from the story might make it less uncomfortable to confront. She told me they were scrambling to onboard new hires without overwhelming them, that morale was shaky, and that people kept asking her what it was like to work with me, like I'd already become a legend instead of a coworker. I didn't feel flattered so much as sad, because I'd been right there the whole time, available, vocal, invested, and they'd only listened once my absence had a price tag. That night, I deleted the last internal document from my personal files, the one I'd kept just in case. And the act felt ceremonial, like closing a door I'd been standing in for years without realizing it was optional. I poured myself a glass of wine, sat on my couch, and felt something like peace settle in, not because everything had worked out perfectly, but because I'd finally stopped hoping the place that hurt me would someday apologize in a way that mattered. 2 days after I finished, my former director tried one last time, and it was almost impressive how predictable it was. Because once the immediate fires were out, leadership slipped back into the same old habits like a muscle memory they didn't even notice. He emailed with a subject line that looked harmless, "Quick question," and asked if I could just confirm a few settings because a new hire was seeing something odd. And I stared at the message for a full minute before replying with a single sentence, "Happy to help under an active contract." He didn't answer for hours, and when he did, the tone had changed. Suddenly apologetic, suddenly respectful, asking what it would take to re-engage me briefly. That word, briefly, had always been the trap, the way small asks turned into big drains, the way emergencies became expectations, and this time, I didn't step into it. I sent my standard terms again, and he came back with a counteroffer that was lower, like he thought the passage of time had softened my boundaries. I didn't argue. I didn't negotiate. I simply declined. And that was the moment I realized how much power I'd handed over for years by believing I had to be agreeable to be valued. Jenna later told me leadership complained I was being difficult, and I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so revealing. A man who sets limits is decisive, a woman who sets limits is difficult, and the label didn't sting anymore because it no longer came with consequences I cared about. In the weeks that followed, my life filled in around the space that job had hollowed out. I started taking walks in the middle of the day without guilt. I ate lunch without multitasking. I visited my sister on a weekend and didn't bring my laptop just in case. And then, one morning, I got a LinkedIn notification that my former director had updated his profile, announcing a new role at another firm with a shiny caption about building resilient teams. And I stared at it, feeling the last thread of attachment snap. He'd left. The company would keep spinning. Jenna would find her way out eventually. And I, for the first time in years, wasn't bracing for impact. I was moving forward on purpose. I never went back to that building, never badge swiped through those doors again, and I didn't need a dramatic final confrontation to know the story was over, because closure didn't come from them admitting they were wrong. It came from me no longer needing them to. Months later, when I ran into an old coworker at a coffee shop and she hesitantly asked if I missed it, I surprised both of us by answering honestly that I didn't. Not the stress, not the constant vigilance, not the feeling that my value depended on how much pain I could quietly absorb. I missed the people sometimes, the versions of us that bonded under pressure, but even that nostalgia softened when I remembered how quickly fear had silenced most of them when I was pushed out. My consulting business stabilized into something real, something sustainable, and for the first time in my career, my calendar reflected my life instead of swallowing it whole. I chose clients. I set boundaries, I build for my expertise without apology. And every so often, usually late at night when things are quiet, I think about that HR meeting, about how they thought firing me would simplify their problems, how they never checked which job actually depended on which. I wasn't disloyal for building something outside that company. I was smart. I was protecting myself in a system that never planned to. If there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's that being indispensable doesn't mean being irreplaceable. It means being exploited until you decide to stop. They taught me that lesson the hard way, and in doing so, they accidentally gave me my career back.